All right, everybody, good afternoon. Hope you guys are doing okay today. The plan for today's class is to finish up this section on GDP called Measuring an Economy's Overall Activity. Should have plenty of time to get through it, work some example problems together, and then we just have really one more topic to cover before your first midterm exam. So we'll go through that last topic next week, and then if I'm looking at the calendar right, your first midterm exam is going to be the following Tuesday. Okay. I don't know if I've mentioned this, but the exams are going to be part multiple choice and part kind of free response type questions. So probably 15 or 16 multiple choice questions, and then maybe 2 or 3 free response type questions. Most of or all of the questions will be kind of applied in nature. So I'm not going to ask you to, spit back a definition at me. Okay, they're going to require that you kind of understand a concept and be able to apply it to a problem or a situation that you haven't quite seen before. So that's what's on the horizon. I think working the problems that are in the slides as well as the practice review questions that are on Blackboard. There's also a number of multiple choice practice type questions up on Blackboard as well. I think that's probably the best way to prepare. If you guys do that few hours in the days leading up to the exam, I really think you should be okay. Historically, most students get A's or B's in this class. It's not an easy class, but there's hardly ever D's or F's, anything like that. So I don't expect that in here either. Okay, if I'm remembering this right, so in the last few minutes of class, we were talking about the investment component of GDP. So GDP, if we want to think about it in terms of expenditures, can be broken down into these 4 components. There's consumption spending, investment spending, government spending, and also net exports. Consumption spending was the spending by households on goods and services. It included what? Durables, non-durables, and services. I kind of had to rush through the investment component in the last few minutes of class, but if you'll recall, that is basically comprised of spending on capital equipment, things like machines and tools, also structures, warehouses, office buildings, as well as residential housing, new residential housing, intellectual property, and then adjustments in inventories. This last one is important because this is how we account for goods that aren't actually sold to an end user in the year, but we want to count the market value of that good towards GDPs. And so it's calculated in the inventory investment component of GDP. Okay, moving on to the third component is government spending. This has a really easy definition, all right? And again, stop me along the way if any of this is confusing, okay? Government spending is the spending on goods and services by all levels of our government. So not just the federal government in Washington, D.C., but also every state government and every local government. We add up all of the spending on goods and services at the local, state, and federal level. That's the G component of gross domestic product. Examples, military goods, rifles, armor, Kevlar, right? These are part of government spending. Roads, bridges, libraries, schools, all of these things count towards government purchases, component of GDP. There is one big category of, let's say, things that the government spends money on, however, that is not counted towards government spending as a component of GDP. And I want to talk about that for a few minutes because it's important that you know this distinction. And that is that G excludes what are called transfer payments. Examples of transfer payments that I'm sure you're familiar with are things like Social Security benefits or unemployment compensation for those who've been laid off from their job. Those are called transfer payments, and they're not actually part of government spending when we calculate or conceptualize gross domestic product. Now, why do you think that is? Why would we want to exclude something like our grandparents' Social Security checks when we're thinking about the total size of gross domestic product. So I think what you're trying to say there is that when that transfer payment occurs, a good or service is not rendered in exchange for that. That's exactly right. Remember what GDP is supposed to reflect. It's supposed to reflect the overall kind of productive capacity of the economy. That is, how many goods and services we're actually producing. Well, these transfer payments are not rendered in exchange for actual goods and services. Right? Now, when a Social Security beneficiary spends those dollars on toothpaste or clothing or food, then those transactions get counted towards GDP, but the transfer payments themselves do not. You can think of transfer payments as like negative taxes, right? When you're taxed by the government takes some of your resources and uses it to spend on goods and services. Or alternatively, it takes those resources and gives it to somebody else, like a Social Security beneficiary or someone who is receiving temporarily unemployment compensation. Those are transfer payments. I think the easiest way to think about them is that they're negative taxes, right? And so they're not given in exchange for actual production of goods and services. And so even though the total payments in Social Security are billions and billions of dollars, those aren't actually included in the government spending portion of GDP. Yes, Sean? Well, there's multiple components of the stimulus package. Some of those components are tax cuts, right? So that would not show up directly in GDP. But to the extent that you spend the extra disposable income on goods and services, that would affect GDP. Other parts of the stimulus program, however, would be the government buying goods directly. And so in that sense, G would go up. Other parts of the stimulus program are payments to local and state governments so that they don't have to lay off a bunch of government employees. And so that is actually in the government compensation category, which is slightly different. When you want to think about government spending, it's on actual physical goods and services. Yeah, those stimulus packages comprise a lot of different types of stuff. Okay, other questions about that? How about the last category? So that's the net exports. How do we define net exports? This is the value of our country's exports, EX, minus the market value of our imports, IM, right? So exports, hopefully you guys remember this. I believe we talked about this in a previous section of the course. This is spending by foreign residents on goods and services that are produced domestically, right? That's a U.S. export, right? Imports would be spending by U.S. residents on goods and services that are produced abroad, all right? It's the value of exports minus our imports that counts towards gross domestic product. So a quick example. Let's suppose that the Microsoft Corporation sold a software license to a Korean company for $10 million. What happens to U.S. net exports as a result of that? Goes up or goes down? If Microsoft, a U.S. company, sells a software license to a Korean company, Matt? That's right. So U.S. exports would rise by 10 million. There's no change in our imports, and so U.S. net exports go up by 10 million, which contributes 10 million to our gross domestic product. Very good. Okay, let me ask you guys this question. Why is it, so this is another kind of important conceptual question. Why is it you think we have to actually subtract out the market value of imports when we're computing gross domestic product? Why do we want to do that? Why do we actually have to physically subtract out all of the value of our imports from GDP? Sean? Okay, yeah, so remember, GDP is supposed to reflect domestic production of goods and services. Sean, that's right, but let me ask you a follow-up question. If that's true, why don't we just ignore inputs? In other words, why don't we calculate GDP as just C plus I plus G plus exports? Say again? Well, the money is going to another country, but don't try not to think about this in terms of money. Try to think about this in terms of domestically produced goods and services, okay? If GDP is supposed to add up everything we're producing domestically, why do we actually have to subtract out, why can't we just treat GDP as C plus I plus G plus exports, right? This is everything we consume, everything we invest, everything the government purchases, plus all the stuff that the rest of the world buys from us. Shouldn't that be GDP? What am I neglecting here? What is inside of C, I, and G? Some of the goods that we've imported, right? Some of the dollars that we're spending on consumption goods are on things that aren't produced domestically, a lot of them. Some of the investment products that firms and businesses purchase aren't produced domestically. Some of the stuff that governments buy aren't produced domestically. And so we actually have to subtract out the total market value of imports from this equation in order to get just domestic production. Let me give you guys a really simple example to show you how the accounting works. Sean, let's suppose I buy a $20 bag of Costa Rican coffee, okay? How does that affect GDP? Think about it through this equation. Coffee is a non-durable consumption item. So my consumption spending goes up by 20 bucks. However, that item has to be imported from Costa Rica. And so imports rise by $20. And so what happens to net exports? They fall by $20. So the increase in consumption is perfectly offset by the reduction in net exports, and there's no change on GDP. That's how the accounting works. We have to subtract out imports because a lot of the stuff that people, businesses, and governments are buying in our country is actually produced overseas or in a different country. Okay, so bear that in mind. That's the reason why we actually have to subtract out imports from our definition of GDP. Okay, you guys have any questions then about that conceptually? Let me show you some data on these variables, these statistics here, just to give you some indication about kind of how big they are for the US economy. Now, I'm not going to ask you guys to memorize these specific numbers. Believe me, I'm not going to do that, but I do think you should be generally familiar with kind of how large they are. So this shows the breakdown of GDP between consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports for 2019. That's what we have complete, the most recent year with complete annual data. GDP in 2019 was close to $21.5 trillion. Consumption spending was made up about $14.5 trillion of those dollars. Investment was $3.7 trillion, which was about the same as government spending, and net exports was negative $610 billion. What does this mean, to be a negative number? Sean? Where the market value of the stuff we're importing from the rest of the world is larger than the market value of the stuff that the rest of the world is buying from us. This number has been negative in the United States for many years now. This second column here, I think, is maybe a bit easier to interpret. It shows each category as a percentage of GDP. So what do we see here? That consumption spending makes up about 2/3 of every dollar of GDP in our economy. Investment and government spending is about 17 or 18 cents on the dollar, right? Net exports is about negative 3 cents on the dollar. To put these numbers in perspective that you can appreciate a little bit more, the last column has taken the absolute numbers and divided them by the total population of the United States. that way we've expressed them in terms of their per capita values. We're going to see this concept over and over again in this semester, per capita. That means divided by the population. And just to be clear here, the measure of the population that I'm using in these ratios is the total adult working population. So it's not going to include children under the age of 16. What do we see here for per capita GDP? It's about $65,000 per year. So average income in the US in 2019 was $65,000. Average spending per person on consumption goods was about $44,000. Investment, about $11,000. Government spending on a per person basis is about $11,000. And then net exports is close to negative $2,000 on a per capita basis. Again, you don't have to memorize these specific numbers, but I think you should be generally familiar with the fact that consumption is the biggest component of GDP, makes up about 2/3. Investment and government spending are about the same in the US. It's not true of every country. And net exports are negative and actually have been negative for a while. And we'll talk much more about that later on in the semester. Okay, questions about the data then? Pretty straightforward. Let's do a quick kind of practice exercise to test your understanding of this stuff so far. So in each of these cases, I want you to tell me how much GDP and each of its components is affected, if at all. Suppose that Debbie spends $200 to buy her husband dinner at the finest restaurant in Boston. What is the impact on gross domestic product and what category of GDP is affected, if at all? Neff? Yeah, so consumption, this is a non-durable good, right? This is a restaurant meal and it will rise by 200 and so GDP will go up by 200. Really straightforward. How about B? Sarah spends $1,800 on a new laptop to use in her publishing business. The laptop was built in China. How does that transaction impact GDP? A new laptop to use in her publishing business. Well, what kind of product is that? Well, be careful. It's going to be used in her publishing business. So it's actually an investment good. It's part of the equipment component of investment, right? But Matt, what other nugget of information is in the problem that is relevant here? It's from China, which means that it is an import and it should not affect GDP, right? And so what happens here is that equipment investment rises by 1,800, net exports fall by 1,800, and so there's no change in GDP that year. How about C? Jane spends $1,200 on a computer to use in her editing business. She got last year's model on sale for a great price from a local manufacturer. What is the impact on GDP in this example? Again, what type of good is it? Is it a consumption good, an investment good, or a government spending good? It's an investment good, right? It's a computer to use in her editing business, right? It's a good, remember how we define investment. These are goods that are used to produce future goods. But she got last year's model on sale. So it's a used good. And so Neff, how do we account for that in our GDP statistics? So this is equipment investment goes up by 1,200, but when she purchases this good, inventory investment falls by 1,200. And so the net effect on GDP is going to be 0. We want that to be the case because the computer was built last year. So the value of that computer, Neff, was counted towards GDP in the previous year as part of inventory investment because it wasn't sold yet. How about GM builds $500 million worth of cars, but consumers only buy $470 million worth of them. What is the impact on GDP? Matt? So do the accounting for me. Where do the numbers go in the various components of GDP? Consumer durables in particular, since these are cars, okay? That's right. So inventory investment rises by 30 million and consumer durables goes up by 470 million. So the total impact on GDP then is 500 million. Again, we want GDP to reflect the market value of all current production. It doesn't actually matter at the end of the day if those goods are sold to an end user. Well, it does matter, but not for the conceptual definition of GDP. That's what I meant to say. Okay, y'all have any questions then about that? Pretty straightforward. You're very likely to see some variety of a question like that on your exam, where I'm going to describe a transaction or a situation, and you'll need to figure out whether or not it affects GDP, and if so, which category. Is it consumption, investment, government spending, net exports? Okay, so let me move on to kind of the last main section of this chapter, and that is on this distinction between what we call real versus nominal GDP. So to kind of motivate this, let me ask you guys a purely hypothetical question. So let's suppose that in 2020, GDP is around $22 trillion. That's what the data is suggesting. What would happen if we fast forward, we get into our time machine and we go to 2021 and GDP next year ends up being $44 trillion. So it doubles over the course of 1 year. Can we unequivocally say that the economy's productive capacity, that its total output of actual goods and services has doubled from 1 year to the next? Remember what GDP is supposed to reflect. It's the value of all goods and services produced. So if we witness GDP going from 20 to $40 trillion, can we definitely say that the economy's production of actual goods and services has doubled from 1 year to the next? Yes or no, you think? No. Why not? Sean? GDP can change over time for two reasons. Because we're producing a different quantity of goods and services, but also because the prices of those goods and services is changing, right? Remember, GDP is the market value of stuff. We measure market value using actual market prices. So GDP can go up either because actual output goes up and or because the prices of those things are actually going up. When studying the behavior of GDP over time, economists want to be able to separate these two effects. Now, why is that? Why would we want to be able to separate the effects? Because economists would actually rather have a statistic or some measure of economic activity that really reflects actual quantities of goods and services, that isn't kind of polluted or distorted by changes in prices over time, okay? Inflation, which is the growth of prices from 1 year to the next, obscures our understanding of what gross domestic product is, right? It gives us a distorted image of how much our country's productive capacity is actually going up by, okay? And so to try to correct this issue or deal with this problem, economists have come up with actually two notions of gross domestic product. One is nominal GDP, the other is real GDP. I want to talk about the differences between those two really for the rest of class today. So let's start with the easier concept, that is nominal GDP. This is actually, even though I haven't said it yet, this is actually the concept that we've been talking about so far in this class. Nominal GDP simply values the output of all of our goods and services at the prices that prevail currently or today, okay? Because prices tend to change over time, nominal GDP is obviously not going to be corrected for the effects of inflation. Real GDP is something different. Real GDP doesn't value output of goods and services using today's prices, but rather it values all of that stuff that we're producing using prices that prevailed at some specific date in the past, what economists refer to as a base year or sometimes a reference year, okay? That's what real GDP is. It's basically the answer to the following question. If we valued today's production of goods and services at prices that prevailed in the past base year, rather than prices that we actually see today, the answer to that problem would give us real gross domestic product. And since real GDP uses fixed base year prices to sum up the value of everything, it is, in a sense, going to be corrected for the effects of inflation. All right, so nominal GDP doesn't account for or is not corrected for the effects of inflation, but real GDP does try to correct for those effects. Now, instead of just talking about this in theory, I think it's easiest to go through a couple of straightforward examples, concrete examples, to show the exact difference between what we mean by nominal versus real GDP. So here is the exercise that I want to do for the next few minutes. Let's pretend that we live in an economy that, again, just produces two goods. We only care about consuming pizzas and lattes, some combination of the two. Here is a table that has data for our economy for 3 consecutive years, 2017 through 2019, and it's got the price of a pizza and a latte per unit, as well as the quantity of each that is sold, right? So for example, in 2017, there are 400 pizzas produced and sold at a price of $10 per pizza, okay? Use this data to compute first nominal GDP for each year. So how do we do that? What does nominal GDP do? It values current production at current prices. So nominal GDP in this type of applied problem is really nothing more than adding up the total value of the economy's kind of shopping list here, right? So to compute nominal GDP for 2017, we just take the price of a pizza, $10, multiply it times the number sold, 400, and add to that how much we spend on lattes, $2 per latte times 1,000, and so nominal GDP is just $6,000. Very straightforward. What is nominal GDP for 2018? $11 per pizza times 500 pizzas, plus $2.50 per latte times 1,100 lattes, and if I did the math right there, nominal GDP has gone up now to 8,250. For 2019, you can do the arithmetic. Nominal GDP should be 10,800. Okay, so that's really easy to do. You'll notice here that our measure of nominal GDP is increasing over time, right? There was a 37.5% increase in nominal GDP between 2017 and 2018. Nominal GDP rose again by about 31% between the years of 2018 and 2019. But that growth in nominal GDP reflects two things. That's the point of this simple little exercise. This 37 and 31% increase in GDP reflects growth in two things. Well, one, we are actually producing more of both goods over time, right? We're producing 100 additional pizzas per year as we go from 2017 to 2019, and 100 additional lattes over that same period per year. So part of this growth in nominal GDP reflects that growth in quantities. But the other part of it reflects the fact that the prices of these goods have gone up. Pizza prices have gone up by $1 per year. Latte prices have gone up by 50 cents per year, right? And so if we were to just look at these statistics here, these numbers would tend to overstate quite dramatically the total increase in this country's kind of productive capacity. Why is that? Because these numbers are distorted or confounded with increases in actual prices. How do we get a measure of GDP that corrects for those inflationary effects? Well, we have to compute real GDP, okay? So how do we do that? The first step in computing real GDP is obviously to select a base year. If real GDP measures current production at base year prices, then we have to know what the base year is. Now, in most of these types of simple little applied problems, the first year in the table will choose for the base year. If you see a problem like this on your exam, I'll tell you what the base year is. That will be indicated in the problem. So here, let's just assume that the base year we've selected is 2017. So the prices that we're going to use to value production over time are the prices that prevailed in 2017. So what is real GDP then in each of these 3 consecutive years? Well, in 2017 rather, it would be what? The base year prices, $10 and $2, times the quantities that prevailed in that year, 400 pizzas and 1,000 lattes, giving us a real GDP of $6,000. How do we add up real GDP for 2018 then? John? Perfect. You take quantities in 2018 and multiply them by the base year prices and add them up. We're valuing 2018 quantities at prices in the base year. That should add up to $7,200. Real GDP for 2019 would then be $10 per pizza times 600 pizzas, plus $2 per latte times 1,200 lattes, or $8,400. Here, GDP is still increasing. Real GDP increases by 20% between 2017 and 2018, and again, another 16.7% between 2018 and 2019. However, you'll notice that the difference between the last slide and the one before that is that nominal, so this just repeats the numbers from the previous slide on nominal GDP. Nominal GDP growth reflects both the increase in quantities as well as the increase in prices. And that's why those numbers are larger than the growth rates of real GDP. Real GDP reflects only the increase in quantities, because it assumes that prices are fixed for those 3 years at the prices that we saw in 2017. So real GDP in this sense corrects for the effects of inflation where nominal GDP doesn't, right? If you were to just look at data on nominal GDP growth, you would overstate the true growth rate of this economy, right? You want to look at the data that just reflects growth in quantities. Which of these 2 measures of economic activity do you think is better for telling us something about how healthy an economy is? Real or nominal GDP? Which is a better measure kind of economic well-being, so to speak? Sean? Probably real GDP, right? In fact, we can look at some extreme examples of countries whose nominal GDP goes up, but because they're experiencing really high levels of inflation, their real GDP is actually going down, right? Like a country like Venezuela, for instance, has experienced dramatic inflation rates in recent years, tens of thousands of %, right? So their prices have gone up so much that their nominal GDP is going to be rising, But if you look at real production in those economies, it's actually been falling. So if you want a measure of economic activity that's more reflective of how healthy the overall economy is, real GDP is a much better statistic to look at. It's not polluted or distorted by the effects of price changes over time. Here is some data I want to show you guys on nominal versus real GDP for the US economy over the period 1960 through 2019. I think there's two so the blue line is nominal GDP and the red line is real GDP. There's two kind of characteristics that jump out at me that I think you should be familiar with. And one is that regardless of which measure of gross domestic product you look at, it appears to me that GDP tends to grow over time, right? That GDP is certainly higher today than it was several years ago and several years before that. Take real GDP, for instance. In 1960, it was around $3.5 trillion. Real GDP in 2019, closer to $19 trillion. So by that measure, real GDP has gone up by a factor of about 5 since 1960. That's what we call long-run economic growth. This idea that gross domestic product tends to get higher over time. We're going to spend at least a couple of weeks after your first exam talking about the details of long-run economic growth and developing a model that can help explain why it occurs. That's one thing that you should look at, is that both of these lines kind of trend up over time. The other thing that jumps out at me, however, is that that growth in GDP is not steady, right? The line kind of wiggles around over time. In some years, it's kind of above its trend, but in other years, it's definitely below its trend, right? You guys know what we call these episodes where real GDP kind of dips below its long-run trend line? Those are called recessions, right? You can see the big one right here in 2009, 2010. That gives you some indication of how severe the Great Recession was compared to recessions we've experienced earlier. It was the largest and most painful we've experienced since the 1983 recession. And some might even say since the Great Depression. This line only goes back to 1960, but if I took it all the way back to the 1930s, you would see this massive collapse in real GDP during the Great Depression that lasted about 7 or 8 years, actually. A couple questions. Why is the blue line steeper than the red line? Why is nominal GDP over time steeper than real GDP? I'm really comfortable with awkward silences. It's awkward for you, but it's not awkward for me. Matt? Sam, is that right? Okay. Were you going to say something like that? That's right, Sam. The blue line is increasing for 2 reasons. This goes back to a point I've tried to hammer into your brains, is that nominal GDP rises because quantities rise, that is growth in real GDP, but it also rises because prices are going up. So Sam recognizes something interesting here. As long as the blue line is steeper than the red line, that indicates that the US economy has experienced positive inflation. That is, general level of prices have gone up over time. If you were to see episodes where the blue line had a slope that was smaller than the red line, then Sam, what is happening? Prices are falling and we're experiencing deflation. One of those times, by the way, would have been during the Great Depression. Why do the 2 lines intersect in I don't know, 2012? That's strange. Why do they intersect that year? Matt? Well, the economic models that I'm familiar with that we build oftentimes incorporate exponential growth in underlying factors, which cause GDP to have exponential growth. That is true, but that doesn't. Why are both of those two lines kind of have that growth? But why is it that they intersect? What's so special about 2012? That's the question I'm really asking here. Why is 2012 so special? No, you're thinking about it too much. Let me go back a couple of slides. Did you guys notice what real GDP was in 2017 in our stupid little pizza latte example? It was the same as nominal GDP. Why? Because we were in the base year. Matt, what do you think 2012 is? That's the base year that the Bureau of Economic Analysis has selected in their construction of the GDP data, real GDP data. They don't update the base year all that frequently. About every 5 to 8 years, they will come out with a big revision of the GDP statistics historically, and they will typically update the base year. And so I think we're actually due for one pretty soon. And the base year in the new statistics might be like 2018. And when that happens, these two lines will intersect at that point, right? Nominal and real GDP are the same by definition in the base year. So I guess it was kind of a trick question. Nothing about the recession or anything like that. It's because 2012 is actually the base year here. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about here with regards to real and nominal GDP is that we can actually use these two statistics to come up with a third statistic that tells us something about how quickly the overall level of prices is rising in our economy. And that is this thing called the GDP deflator. So let me give you a definition of what the deflator is, and then we'll kind of talk about conceptually why it reflects price growth instead of growth in quantities. So here's how we define the GDP deflator. It's essentially the ratio of nominal GDP to real GDP. And then the statisticians just multiply that ratio by 100 to express it in terms of an index number. Okay, now why is it you think that the GDP deflator measures kind of the change in prices over time? So real GDP and growth in real GDP is supposed to tell us something about how much the quantities of goods and services are growing in our economy. The GDP deflator, if we compare its value over time, should tell us something about kind of the general level of prices and how those are changing in our economy. Now, why is that, you think? What's the difference between nominal and real GDP? Just the prices, right? The quantities are actually the same. What's nominal GDP? It's current prices times current quantities. P times Q, let's say. What is real GDP? It's base year prices times current quantity. So prices in the base year times Q. If you were to cancel out the quantities in that ratio, what would you be left with? Essentially prices in the current year over prices relative to some base year, right? And so the GDP deflator in that sense is going to tell us something about how much prices of all goods and services have changed from the base year to the current year. Now, I think the biggest reason why the GDP deflator is a useful variable for us to pay attention to is because it we can use it to tell us something about the economy's inflation rate. Now, let me stop right here for a minute and make sure that everybody is familiar with what we mean by the inflation rate. An economy's rate of inflation, and we're going to see this really at multiple points during the semester, is different. The inflation rate is different than the general level of prices. Or another way of saying that is kind of like the current cost of living. How are they, those two concepts are related, but they're different. How is inflation related to the price level? What's the difference between those two things? When we say the inflation rate, what are we actually referring to there? Sean? How much, say again, how much the dollar? Well, it's how much the value of the dollar is changing by. Okay, and that is true. I agree with that. And later on in the semester, when we talk about the monetary system, we'll discuss how the value of our money is related to inflation. But for right now, the way to distinguish between these two is that what the inflation rate actually tells you is essentially how quickly the general level of prices is rising over time, right? So we can take a snapshot of the economy right now and see kind of what everything costs, right? That's not what the inflation rate tells us. The inflation rate tells us how expensive things are relative to what they were last year, specifically the rate of change of those prices. Okay, so one way to compute the inflation rate is to actually apply this growth rate formula to the GDP deflator. So an economy's inflation rate, let's say in year 2, would be the GDP deflator from year 2 minus what the deflator was last year, divided by that difference divided by what the deflator was last year. It's the percentage change in the overall price level, where the GDP deflator is our notion of the overall price level. The inflation rate is the rate of growth in the GDP deflator. So we multiply this ratio by 100% to express it as a growth rate. That's a subtle but important distinction, right? When we say the inflation rate in the US economy is 2%, what are we saying? That prices of most goods and services are rising by about 2% per year. Let's calculate the GDP deflator and the inflation rate in our earlier example. So here I'm carrying these numbers over from the previous table, right? We have nominal and real GDP for these 3 consecutive years. What is the GDP deflator if I give you this data? We'll just plug the numbers into the formula. The GDP deflator for 2017 would be nominal divided by real GDP. Both of those are measured in dollars, by the way, so the dollar signs cancel, and we multiply that ratio times 100, giving us a GDP deflator of exactly 100. Matt, in the base year, the GDP deflator will always be 100 because real and nominal GDP are the same in the base year, right? So exactly the same reason why we saw nominal and real GDP intersect in 2012. If I'd show you data on the deflator, it would be equal to 100 in 2012. What's the GDP deflator for 2018? Would be nominal GDP of 8250 divided by 7200 in real GDP times 100 is 114.6. So what does that number tell us then? It's greater than 100. And so prices have gone up in 2018 relative to the base year, which is 2017. The deflator for 2019 is 10,800 in nominal GDP divided by 8,400 times 100 is 128.6. The deflator is again higher, meaning that prices of goods and services, in our example, pizzas and lattes, have gone up yet again between 2018 and 2019. Once we've computed the deflator, it's very easy to calculate the inflation rates, right? We just apply the growth rate formula to these numbers. What is the inflation rate then between 2017 and 2018? It's 14.6%. Now, just to be clear, where do those numbers come from? That's 114.6 minus 100. So that's the difference in the deflators between 2018 and 2017, divided by the GDP deflator from 2017, times 100%, and we get 14.6%. So there was close to 15% inflation in our silly little too-good economy in this first year. The rate of inflation between 2018 and 2019 is 12.2%. That's 128.6 minus 114.6. That difference divided by 114.6. Once again, prices of pizza and lattes went up, and you can verify that in the tables earlier. Why don't we have an inflation rate for 2017 here? I've got an inflation rate for 2018 and one for 2019. Why can't I compute one for 2017? Well, I haven't given you data for 2016, right? And the inflation rate for 2017 would require information about the deflator from 2016, which, if there's inflation, would actually be less than 100, right? So in truth, there is an inflation rate for 2017, but I haven't given you enough data to be able to answer that question, right? Okay, in the interest of time, I'm gonna skip this learning exercise. If I have some time in the next week, I can come back to it. But in the meantime, let me just kind of show you guys what the answers are. This is the same type of problem that we just did. Okay, so here's a, good A and good B, prices and quantities. I want you to compute nominal GDP in 2017, real GDP in 2018, and then the deflator in 2019. So this is just another practice problem where you can improve your skills on computing real and nominal GDP as well as the deflator and understanding the distinctions between them. Here are the answers if you want them to write them down, and then you can kind of come back to them later. So nominal GDP in 2017 is 46,200. Real GDP in 2018 ends up being $50,000. And let's see, the deflator in 2019 was 112.1. So write those numbers down, and then I would encourage you to take a look, try to do this problem later on and see if you can get those. If you can, then I think you understand this stuff quite well. It should be okay. All right, any last questions then about that? Sean? Yes, yeah. You guys can use a calculator if you want on an exam, but it can't be your cell phone. Anything that can like store images or connect to the web or whatever, I can't allow that. So bring a pocket calculator or a graphing calculator or something like that. Worst case scenario, Sean, you forget your calculator. On that type of problem, you can, if it's a free response question, you can write the arithmetic, and if I see that you know how to calculate it right, I'll give you credit. Even if you weren't able to compute the actual number. It's more important to me that you understand the formulas and how to apply them than it is if you get the exact number right. Let me finish this topic, last 15 minutes of class today, talking about this notion that GDP is necessarily a really good measure of economic well-being. So I kind of motivated this particular part of the course, just talking about how we observe the macroeconomy. And for better or worse, the main statistic, the headline statistic that most people look at to determine whether or not the economy is performing poorly or well is real GDP. In fact, real GDP per capita, right, is so average real incomes of people in the economy is the main indicator of an average person's standard of living in that country, all right? That's what most economists view, is that these per capita real GDP variables are useful because it gives us a decent indication of what the average person's standard of living in that country is, okay? I think there's good reasons to use real GDP to measure that, right? Countries that have higher levels of per capita GDP, the typical person is going to be able to purchase more goods that actually improve our material well-being, right? Things like better healthcare, better housing, better food and nutrition. You can afford more leisure time. These are things that actually improve our standards of living. And so real GDP per capita is probably it may be the very best measure of economic well-being for a society. But not every economist thinks like that, okay? There are certainly economists out there that dispute this notion that real GDP is a really good measure of economic or societal well-being, okay? One of those is a guy named Joseph Stiglitz, who actually won the Nobel Prize in economics along with a few other people in 2001, not for his criticism of GDP as a measure of economic well-being, but for other theoretical work that he did earlier in his career. But in recent years, he's become one of the chief critics of looking at GDP as the appropriate measure of economic well-being. What I want you guys to do, I'm gonna take you to this YouTube video. It's about 8 minutes. I want you to watch it and then write down on the next slide some of the things that he points out about why GDP is not a perfect measure of economic well-being. What are some things that it leaves out? In what sense is GDP a flawed or imperfect measure of societal or economic well-being? And then we'll spend a few minutes talking about them. The reason I want to cover this is because I think GDP is an important concept to understand, but it is by no means the end-all discussion in economics. There are other things that we should look at that aren't necessarily accounted for properly in GDP.
The world is thinking.
One of the reasons for my interest in this subject is accounting frameworks do affect behavior. You know, we saw that in the United States in the 90s, where people have bad accounting and that affected their behavior. Some of what we're going on now is a reflection of bad accounting. So more generally, information affects behavior. And so what we gather our information about, how we describe success, affects what we strive for. If GDP is what we think is success, people will strive for GDP. And political leaders all the time say, you know, look at what we've done. You know, they always put it, you know, I've succeeded in getting the economy to grow at 6%. Now, what he did is hard to figure out, but that's the politician does that. You know, I've created X million jobs. So that's part of the political rhetoric. The question is, by doing that, they focus policies on things that will increase GDP. There's actually, in forming the commission, we've identified a large number of ways in which GDP is not a good measure of economic performance or societal well-being. And so what we're trying to do is partly to focus the global conversation about these other measures, but also come up with some summary counting frameworks and statistics. So let me just mention a couple of them. One of them I've already alluded to, which is GDP doesn't tell you about what happens to the typical citizen. And this is an increasing problem because when you have growing inequality in society, you can have GDP going up, as it has been in the United States, but most people getting worse off. Not just poverty going up, but the median income, 50% or more of people getting worse off. So that's one example of a metric. We ought to know what's happening to the median person. It's very hard to find statistics about that across countries. One of the things that I tried to, when I was at the Council of Economic Advisors, tried to generate was a focus on green GDP. That is to say, to take account of environmental degradation and resource depletion. This is particularly important in developing countries that may be growing by cutting down their forest, but once they cut down the forest, there's nothing there. And so unless they do something, it's not sustainable. GDP tells you nothing about sustainability. Another example is GDP measures. IMF thought Argentina was doing great in the early 90s. I happened to look at the data in a more fine-grained way, and we said, this is not sustainable. If you only looked at GDP, you would not have realized that. So in the first context, there are ways that you can take out for depletion of natural resources and degradation of the environment. If you do that, China's growth gets significantly lowered. It's still doing well, but it is much lower than it otherwise would have been. Interesting story about the role of special interest. When we tried to push for this, and people in the Department of Commerce were excited about doing this, the coal industry basically passed a proviso or threatened to pass a proviso to take away funding for any research that would support these alternative measures. Because they knew that green GDP would not be good for the coal industry. So, to me, that reinforced my belief why it's important to measure these things. Another example, just is the difference between GDP and GNP. Those of you who are older, when you went to school, you talked about GNP.
Right.
And about 1990, they switched to GDP. Well, everybody said, oh, just a little bit of difference. Well, it turns out that it makes a great deal of difference for many countries. And there's a little bit of, I'm sure somebody's going to write an article about whether there is a political context to the switch. GDP looks at the output within the country. GNP looks at the income of the people in the country. Well, when you started privatizing a great deal, you had economic activity within the country, but the income from that economic activity more and more going to people outside the country. So you have a mine, somebody taking a mine in the country, leaving behind environmental degradation, royalties in some cases of 1 or 2%. So almost none of the income from the mine goes to the people in the country. So GDP is going up, but any measure of green GNP would show the country going down. And some really dramatic examples, like in Papua New Guinea, where this actually is true. So there are other aspects of health, leisure, the fact that, just to give you two other dramatic examples, the United States, as you may know, has about 10 times as many people per capita in prison as other advanced industrial countries. That contributes to our GDP because we have to spend money incarcerating them. And some states now are spending as much on prisons, construction of prisons, as they are in universities. Well, that's good for GDP, but any measure of societal well-being says it's not good to have so many people in prison. And it's a symptom of something dysfunctional. We can have a long discussion about what it is that's dysfunctional, but it's not positive. Another example is we spend more on healthcare than any other country as a percentage of GDP, and our health outcomes are much lower than in other advanced industrial countries, and actually lower than many developing countries. Well, the extra money that we spent on healthcare shows up as a contribution to GDP. If we got more efficient, our GDP could go down. Well, that's clearly not, you don't want to, you're looking at the wrong thing. And so I think this will provide a good forum for thinking a lot more about the strengths and weaknesses of each of our societies.
Okay, just have a few minutes left, but what were some of the main things that Joe Stiglitz there hit on as far as ways in which real GDP or per capita real GDP are not truly reflective of the health of a society? I think this is maybe one of the most important, is that GDP doesn't tell us anything about inequality, okay? It just, that's right. Yeah. So basically what per capita real GDP tells us, if you think about the whole distribution of income in the economy, it just tells you about the mean, right? It doesn't tell you how dispersed income is, that is income inequality. There are other measures of income inequality that you can look at in the data, and I can assure you that whatever measure you want to look at, incomes and wealth have been becoming more unequal over time. There's greater income and wealth inequality today than there was a generation earlier and a generation before that. So GDP doesn't tell us anything about the distribution of income. It's, even a more extreme example, Neff, would be like a Middle Eastern country where literally all of the wealth is owned by a royal family that has access to all of the oil, and then the vast majority of the rest of the population is in poverty, right? Even though those countries, if you look at their total average incomes, are probably in the middle of the income distribution for countries across the whole world. So yeah, economic or income inequality is an important thing that affects our well-being that is not accounted for in GDP. Any others? What were some others that he touched on there in that, I think it was about a 7 or 8 minute clip? Matt? This is also an important one, right? Is he talked about environmental degradation and resource sustainability. You could throw pollution into this category. If we were to somehow come up with an alternative measure of GDP called what he calls green GDP that accounts for that type of sustainability and damage to the environment, then our GDP statistics might not look as good as they otherwise would, right? And so definitely having a clean environment affects our economic well-being, although it's not adequately factored into our notion of gross domestic product. Others? I know I'm running out of time, but I want to make sure we emphasize 2 more. Yeah, what's your name again? Aaron? Okay, go ahead. Like? Yeah, so one of the ones that he talked about there at the very end was that, we have this high prison population in the United States, higher than I think any other developed country. Anytime a state or the federal government has to build a prison, guess what? That counts towards G and adds to GDP, right? But we wouldn't think that a high prison population is reflective of a healthy society. It's reflective of something dysfunctional in our society. And so again, GDP in that sense is only an imperfect measure of economic well-being. He also talked about health outcomes versus health spending, right? You can spend $1 gajillion on healthcare, but if your actual health outcomes are no better than they are in other countries that spend a lot less, then again, that's an indication of something wrong with the social landscape, if you will. He talked about a few other ones. So this one he just barely mentioned in passing, leisure. We don't get paid for the hours that we take off from work. If you're sitting at home reading a book or watching a TV show or sleeping or or riding a bike or doing something, that has economic value to us, right? What is the opportunity cost of an hour of leisure? It's what we could earn if we were in a paid job that hour, right? So the more leisure we enjoy, the greater our economic value is, but that's not accounted for in GDP because leisure is not really a market good that is sold in an organized market. Other non-market activities, and we talked about a little bit about this in the last class, but child care that a parent provides is not counted towards GDP, right? But if you put your child in a daycare center and pay for that, that is counted towards GDP, right? He talked a little bit about this difference between GNP and GDP. I discussed this a little bit in the last class. He didn't really describe the difference very well, but again, what GNP is essentially the income of all of a country's citizens, regardless of what country they're working in, right? So if there is a bunch of multinationals working in a country and their income ends up going to another country, their GDP might be high, but the GNP might actually be significantly lower. I know I'm out of time, but I wanted to at least provide some discussion of this at the end of this chapter, because I don't want you to leave here thinking about, all macroeconomists think about is GDP, and that's how we judge whether or not a society is successful or not. There are other things that we need to take into account. Okay, have a great weekend. I'll see you guys next Tuesday.